The complete Moby Dick novel typed on 6 rolls of toilet paper? The most interesting man alive has the story. I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and these are our incredible stories. Hello, and welcome back to all of our listeners from around the world and across the United States. We are so happy to have you back with us again for some more incredible stories. And you know what? It looks like we have some new guests with us. Come on in, folks. Go ahead, have a seat. Enjoy yourself. You've found your way over to some of the most incredible stories you'll ever find on a podcast. And listen, if you like what you hear, well, as a free gift, we're going to give you free episodes every Friday. Compliments of us. No, go ahead, put away your wallet. There's no need to bring out any money. I guarantee you it's completely free. We just hope that you enjoy it. And if you do like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe to our podcast. And if you think you know somebody who also might enjoy what you are listening to now, well, don't be stingy. Go ahead and share the good news and send them our way. That being said, we are back with a familiar guest that we had last week.
Yes, indeedy, Gary. Edward Meyer is with us again. He's the author of the great book, Buying the Bazaar, and it's a book based on 40 years of adventures with Ripley's Entertainment, and these are the folks who bring you Ripley's Believe It or Not. Great book. I recommend it to anybody who has any kind of interest in the strange, the unusual.
Oh, absolutely.
And nostalgia, for that matter. So welcome back to the show, Edward.
Well, thanks for having me, Gary and Richard. Feel very privileged to come back for a second shot of me.
Yeah.
Well, we really had fun last time. I have to say, we really got some great information, things I didn't even know.
But I have to tell you, Edward, there is no way in our episodes are we going to cram 500 pages worth of absolutely fascinating material. We just have a tip of the iceberg that we're touching.
Well, a lot happened in 40 years. I started writing the book, virtually the day I retired. I'd had it in my brain for quite a while, formulating it, and knew that it was something I wanted to do. And it was really a big part of my retiring a little earlier than people expected me to, because I wanted to make sure I got it all down on paper before I couldn't, before the memory went or the hands went or the whatever. But I had a lot of fun writing it. It was roughly a year in the works, and people seem to enjoy it. So happy to always talk about it to anybody that wants to hear about it.
Yeah, I certainly did enjoy it, Edward. Let's go ahead let's turn the clock back to 1980 now, and you actually became the new Robert Ripley. You were adding massive amounts of artifacts to the Ripley collection. And in 33 years, you were able to add 25,000 new exhibits. And apparently, from what we learned last week, most of Robert L. Ripley's original collection had been dispersed through private auctions. So your collection probably was the collection.
Well, I'm not sure I would say most. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but the Ripley collection was, publicly auctioned. Anybody could have gone in to the auction house and bought a shrunken head, or for that matter, a Picasso painting. Ripley was a big collector of Picasso. It was all there for anybody who wanted to spend some money. And there was just one guy, John Arthur, who bought enough that he could create the first Ripley's Believe It or Not permanent museum in St. Augustine, Florida. But he bought about 5,000 items. And so the museum in St. Augustine maybe had half of that when it first opened. He had a second show that, I don't want to call it a traveling show because it was, didn't travel very far, but it was in trailers and went around the Northeast, Boston, New York City, Washington, D.C., and then, stuff that was in a warehouse that could be changed out once in a while. So, roughly $5,000 items is what is the basis of the Ripley's Believe It or Not collection that people will see today in Ripley's Museum. Well, 5,000 items is really only enough for 2 or 3 museums. And in 1984, Alec Rigby, who we talked about a bit last week, sold the company to another Canadian entrepreneur, Jim Pattison of Vancouver, Canada. And Jimmy, one of the first things he said to us as a company was that he wanted to really grow the museum business because he saw he thought that that's how this company could grow. He wasn't going to get rid of publishing. He wasn't going to get rid of television, but he thought that museums was where the real money was. And he looked us in the face and he said he wanted to build 2 new Ripley museums a year. And we just, jaws hit the ground and went, oh my God, this guy's, where's this coming from? Sir, it's impossible. It's a finite collection. We've got 5,000 items and almost every one of them's already on display. How are we going to build any new ones? Never mind 2 new ones a year. And he pointed at me and said, well, why don't you buy some more stuff? And stuff becomes one of my favorite words in my career because it's hard to explain what the Ripley collection is. It literally is a little bit of everything, so stuff seems to work. So I really had no formal training. I had a general interest, fairly well educated, and suddenly I have the job to be the modern Ripley, modern Marco Polo, ex-Robert Ripley, and I've got to buy museum exhibits. And we went, did a little bit of Las Vegas style mathematics, how much stuff per square foot, et cetera, and came up with a theory that you needed at least 500 items per museum. So if we're going to build 2 museums a year, Edward's got to buy 1,000 items a year. Now, that's free every day of my life, not just Monday to Friday, but throw in the Saturdays, Sundays too. Now, honestly, only a few years did I ever hit that goal, but that was always the goal. 1,000 items every single year. And that went on for 33 years.
Oh, wow.
So the number you quoted, 25, I don't know if that's perfectly current or whatever, but it's a pretty good estimate. And that would get you 700 or 800 a year as an average. So that gives you what my life was like for 33 years. And, to do that, I traveled extensively. I've been to 42 countries, every state but Alaska, every province in Canada, on the move constantly. Probably didn't put in as much travel as Robert Ripley himself, but all over the place, looking at high and low, auction houses, magazines, television shows, antique stores, anywhere and everywhere to find Ripley's, believe it or not, items. Now, I said stuff a little earlier. Ripley's has some very significant historical pieces, has some very significant sports pieces, science pieces, hopefully something for everyone. It's a hodgepodge. The overriding theme is that it's odd, unusual, hopefully unbelievable. Most items unique, one of a kind. Not always, but that's a buying criteria. I want something that the average person hasn't seen, maybe hasn't even heard of, but when they see it, they're going to go, wow, I've never seen that before, and they're going to remember it as something unique to the Ripley's museum experience.
In a way, you really stepped into the shoes of Robert Ripley. Did you ever feel like, my gosh, this is pretty much like what he did himself?
Well, yeah, to an extent. But like I said about Alec Rigby last week, I didn't draw the cartoon. I ended up being the editor of the cartoon. I did an awful lot of writing in my career with Ripley's, but the company is based on an illustration. I can't draw a circle. I can't. There's no art in me whatsoever. So I knew I was in the Ripley mode, following his style, but I was never Ripley because I wasn't doing the hardcore, the centerpiece of the work.
Right, right. Well, as I read through Buying the Bazaar, your subtitle, by the way, The Confessions and Adventures of a Compulsive Collector. I like that subtitle. I discovered who I believe, to me, was a real Indiana Jones. His name was H.M. Lissauer. And you know who he was.
The H.M. stands for Herman Mark. Some people called him Mark. I don't know if anybody called him Herman, maybe his mother. But I always called him Sir. He was Mr. Lissauer. I knew him for years and years and years, but never was, first name basis. He was a concentration camp survivor. His family escaped eventually out of Europe and went to South America. And in South America, he became personally interested in indigenous people and started a personal collection of, tribal artifacts. A few years go by, they moved to Melbourne, Australia. And again, Australia is a little more primitive still than North America. And he gets interested in Australian art, and his family buys a coffee plantation in New Guinea. And from an early age, he starts, making regular trips to New Guinea and the South Sea Islands. And initially, he's buying this stuff for himself, like Robert Ripley. And when I went to his house, he had a pretty good personal collection too. But at some point, he makes the decision that, I want to buy these and sell them. And he dealt with museums all around the world for his entire life. He would go into the wilderness 6 months of the year, buy, come home for a month, catalog, take photos, make measurements, write descriptions, and then with 17 binders divided by country and artifact content, he would travel the Western world selling out of these catalogs to museums. And he found Ripley's before I was there, so from the early 70s he's involved, but for let's call it 30 years. I don't remember exactly how many, but for 30 years, twice a year, he would visit the Ripley office, and I would spend a day looking through 17 big, huge binders, putting little yellow stickies saying, I'm interested in that one, I'm interested in that one. I'd go through all 17 before I'd commit on anything. And then, once I've been through every binder, go back and look at the stickies, see some similarities. Okay, I don't really need that because it's similar to that one, so get rid of that. And narrow it down to something in the neighborhood of, $50,000 would be a typical purchase day with Mark Lissauer. And over the years, probably an average of, maybe 150 items a year bought by him. And, they together probably are much more than the actual Robert Ripley collection, because we bought an awful lot of stuff from Mark Lissauer. Mm-hmm. Fascinating gentleman. Imagine traveling around the world with, multiple suitcases. In the days of airline tickets, it looked like it was 12 feet long sometimes. And he was strict dietitian, Jewish, kosher, all kinds of health issues, and did this for, 50 years, maybe more. Wow. Maybe more. Fascinating man. He's written a short biography. It actually was, it started as an oral project for concentration camp survivors. But the city of Melbourne, Australia, where he spent most of his life, now has a museum of what was left of his collection that he hadn't sold. and they produced this biography that's really a fascinating read.
Mhm. And you mentioned in your book that he spoke a dozen native languages on top of 8 European languages.
Yeah, never ceased to amaze me. Every time I was in his company, I'd learn something new. How did I not know that before? Like I didn't know he'd lived in Venezuela. I didn't know he'd been to Antarctica. Whatever. Fascinating guy. Definitely the most interesting person I've ever met.
Can you give us an example or two of some of the unusual items that you picked up from him? I noticed you did mention bird feather money. What the heck is bird feather money?
Well, it comes from the tiny little island of Santa Cruz, part of the Solomon Islands in the South Seas, not too far from Fiji. It's, general geography. It is bright red. I don't even attempt to pronounce the bird's name, but a little tiny red bird, red like in a cardinal that our audience might be more familiar with. Thousands and thousands and thousands of feathers sewn into a belt coil and transferred in transactions as currency. And these can be, typically they're about 10 feet long unrolled, but they can be twice that. And they're about 4 inches wide, so almost like a belt, but bright, bright red. The bird has gone extinct. And the value of the belt, of course, increased as they became fewer and fewer of the birds. Roughly, typically about $5,000 purchase in my time when I was buying them.
Oh,
and
wow.
I may have bought, 5 or 6 of them.
Wow.
But, I've never been to the Solomon Islands myself. He went there, brought it to me in America. But in my house, I've got stuff from my office, but a permanent reminder of Mr. Lazauer. My wife collects all things tiger, and we have about a 8-foot long tiger rug that's not a real tiger. It looks real, but it's not. It's actually made from yak fur, made in Tibet. And I don't have it on the floor. I've got it mounted on the wall, but, it's one of the first things you see when you come in my house, and people go, wow, what's that? And they learn that it's yak hair and not a real tiger. Most people go, wow, I didn't, never would have believed it.
That's pretty cool.
After I read your book, Edward, I went on eBay and I put in Martin Lissauer's name, and sure enough, I came across 2 items for sale that were actual documents signed by him. One, a 1936 receipt of items, and then I forget what the other document was, but I think it was from 1949. But I wanted the one prior to World War II. Could this be the same Lissauer, or do you think his father had the same name, or do you think this is the same
I'm
gentleman?
going to say it's most likely his father at that period, because he's only 8 years old in the concentration camps in the mid-40s.
Oh, okay, so this is the H.M. Lissauer that would be his father.
I'm sure it must be his father. His father, whom I never met. I met his mother, but his father had a very interesting business that I can't even fathom today. So, anybody younger than me is going to go, what is he talking about? But they cleaned and prepared animal bones to make bone buttons.
Wow, that's interesting.
Okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, and not jewelry per se. I imagine they did some, but buttons, fancy buttons for ladies' clothing, made out of animal bones, and that's how the family got into traveling. The father was going around collecting bones.
Wow.
Yeah, think about that one.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, before you put the dates on it, well, I probably do have a couple personal invoices from Lizauer myself, but Ripley's has hundreds of them because we archived every one of them. So we had a, running record of everything we ever bought from the man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he had the world's worst handwriting. If you weren't in the meeting looking at the photos, making the decision what you were buying, a week later you wouldn't have known what it was. What is that?
Well, the signature on this document that I picked up is readable. You can tell that that's the name, so it must have been Dad.
I imagine it is.
Yeah, that's just amazing. An amazing gentleman and somebody who it's been your honor and privilege to have known and worked with for so many years.
If I may, again, I never met the father, but the mother literally sacrificed herself and her two children so that the father could escape the Nazis. It was him they were actually after. And he got out of Amsterdam, where they were living at the time, and the mother and the children got sent to the concentration camp.
Oh, wow.
And he spent some of the time in the war in England, but went to South America. And when they were liberated, they got on the boat and they hooked up with him, 5 years later in South America.
Mm-hmm. What an incredible...
Again, fascinating man.
Yeah, really.
That's an incredible story in and of itself.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, one of the people that I came in contact with back in the late 1960s when I was researching a book for a book on the Hitler Youth is Karl Silberbauer, who was the Gestapo agent in Amsterdam who arrested Anne Frank and her family. And so, for Lissauer's story to have a connection here, perhaps to the same, Gestapo official, is incredible.
Well, if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam, the Lissauer family is listed. It was a very, very moving experience for my wife and I to read his name on the wall.
Yeah.
Oh, I could see how it would be.
Sure, because you have such a personal connection, such a wonderful connection.
Yeah.
If we move on from Mr. Lissauer to some of the other folks you came in contact with as you collected 1,000 or more artifacts a year for Ripley's, one of the unusual items you mentioned in the book we just have to talk about, and that's John Horwood's strip of skin.
Well, I didn't close the deal on that one, but I consider it the very first thing I ever purchased for Ripley. So it would have been, I believe, 1984, maybe late 83. But it was the skin itself is a very small piece of skin, but the story was a small story in the Toronto Star newspaper that one of my associates, his name was Norm Deska, saw in the paper and said, this would be a really cool item for Ripley. End of conversation. I then made it, my goal for however many days it took to find, the author of the story, then, get a connection to the person that owned the skin, and then eventually to buy the skin. And John Horwood, it's an English story from the early 1800s. Was a young man, teenager, I seem to recall, and he threw a rock at a girl that jilted him and hit her in the head and killed her. John Horwood was sentenced to death for the crime, and the doctor who did, I don't know if it's an autopsy, but, the preparations of the dead, the mortician, signed off that he had done the inspection, blah, 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 on the piece of John's skin. And it's about 3 inches long, maybe 1.5 inches wide. And, in total, maybe it's got like 10 words on it. But, it's got to be the most unusual bookmark in the world.
Yeah, right?
And, I still think is an absolutely fascinating story. And we did that on the TV show as well. That became an episode on the Jack Palance show. But, it's near and dear to my heart because it was the very first thing that I could take credit for adding to the Ripley collection.
Oh, wow. That's certainly a
For
milestone.
most of its career, I can't say where it is today, but it was on display in Australia for many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What an unusual find.
Yeah. Now,
Oh, yeah.
Gary,
And again, I mean, that doesn't fit anybody. Maybe it belongs in a medical museum, I guess. But, it's not something you're going to see anywhere else but
no.
Ripley.
Yeah, of course, of course.
you'd expect to see it in the Ripley's Believe It or Not museum.
Yeah.
That is exactly the type of thing you'd expect to see.
Yeah.
The stuff that you would want to see in a museum of Ripley's. Gary, we're going to talk in a moment about Edward's favorite city where he opened a Ripley's museum, but I'm going to see if you can guess what city that is. I'm going to give you a few clues. All right. It's known for its music.
Okay.
Really, jazz is one of the types of music, but the blues also, and it's got great food.
New Orleans?
I didn't even give you all the clues. What do you mean, New Orleans? Oh, I love the gumbo from New Orleans, and it has Brennan's. I've been to Brennan's. It has history, which I love, and it has
A little bit of everything.
yeah, and downright strange stuff. One of the things that Edward didn't mention in his book when he was talking about New Orleans were the cities of the dead. And I'm sure you visited the cities of the dead, right, Edward?
Well, I've been to most of the graveyards in and around New Orleans, and they're called cities of the dead because they have very elaborate mausoleums built above ground. The water level is so high in New Orleans, the city itself is literally at sea level, that they can't dig into it, so they build up from it. And they're in very nice, neat rows, and some of them, look at least like car garages, if not full houses. So it's nicknamed the City of the Dead because, you can say, fourth row over, sixth row down, and find so-and-so's grave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember...
my first trip there, my first introduction, I guess, was the movie, The Easy Rider, where it has the scene with Peter Falk and Dennis Hopper in the graveyard. That's probably the first I ever heard or saw of them. Mm-hmm. But the very first time I went to New Orleans, I had to go to the St. Louis Cemetery, and it is a spooky place, even in bright daylight. Lots of voodoo stories, lots of things left on the graves that you go, what's that all about? And the artwork / architecture of the mausoleums, there's been several books of them, and you could spend a lifetime studying them.
The tour guide that I had mentioned that they seal these what are they, mausoleums or tombs or whatever?
Yeah.
They seal them up. They seal them up for 1 year and a day, and then they poke an iron rod through to open them and let some of the really lethal gases escape. And when they open them, the bodies have been self-cremated.
There you go. Believe it or not.
Believe it or not. And so my question to you, Edward, is, do you still rate New Orleans as one of your most favorite places in the world?
Well, definitely my favorite place in America. Miles ahead of anywhere else, San Francisco probably being second. But in the world, it would rank pretty high. It's certainly a place I could go back to time and time again. I don't need to spend more than a couple of days, but I would never get tired of New Orleans. And food and music are the big appeals for me. World's best antique shop, Bill Rouse shop on Royal Street. I've done a lot of shopping there. If anybody wants a vampire killing kit, Bill's the guy that'll find you one. As a tourist as well as a working person, there's always something to discover in New Orleans, for sure. And, food and music, huge, huge parts of my other life. So New Orleans, is pretty much at least once a year, every year place.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's unique and unusual, and it's kind of bizarre in a way, too. But
the only place you'd ever find a president of the United States playing saxophone in a jazz club.
That's right.
That's very true. That's very true.
That's right. In addition to wonderful places, there were some incredible tasks being performed at Ripley's while you were there, and I know you had quite a bit to do with the publishing arm. We've got a number of your books you were involved with spread out here in front of us as we're talking. And I had to ask myself, because you mentioned in your book that the cartoonist had to come up with 30 unbelievable stories a week. How in the world can you come up with 30 different research stories a week?
Well, at times, the most recent Ripley's cartoonist named John Graziano, and he started with the company in 2005, and probably within the first couple years, he started doing almost all the work himself. But prior to John, there was a research staff that would find it, and then the artist would draw it, and then Edward, the editor, would fuss about it and, say it was too long or wasn't big enough, and, get everybody mad at me before it finally got printed. But full-time researcher, the very first one that worked, hand in hand with Robert Ripley, his name was Norbert Perlroth, and he worked for the company for 52 years. I mean, amazing. Like, again, probably right beside Mark Lizauer is one of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. But he literally went to the 42nd, I think it's 42nd Avenue in New York, the big main library. There's actually a Norbert Perlroth reading room now because he went so often. But he went to the library 5 days a week, 8-9 hours a day, picked books off the shelf and read. And he read in like 12, 13 different languages too. And, he would come into the office only on Friday, plump down however many stories he found, with 30 being the minimum, and say, here's what I found this week. And Norbert, was truly avarice reader, but an amazing guy. And, every day, every week, he found what he needed to find. Hard to imagine. After him, I hired a lady named Karen Kemlow, and she was a would-be journalist. And I'll always remember that her little test to get the job was she did a story on tattoos, which at the time, very few people had, not like today. But, it was a constant challenge. And, if you came in to the office with only 30, you were in trouble because that's the minimum. And the editor isn't always going to like him. And the artist isn't always going to like him, though his opinion's not as important as the editor's. But, typically we would look at maybe 50 items a week to call the 30. And, it's a tough full-time job, but a real fun job.
Yeah.
I mean, the person who gets that job stays there because they love it.
Yeah, they would.
There's only been 7 artists in the history of Ripley's, but there's only been like 3 researchers. So.
Yeah, and churning something out like that, like they did the old time serials back in the 1930s, one a week. It was fun working on them, but it was not easy either. Coming up with meeting deadlines and producing the goods.
We would meet every Friday afternoon at the same time. And there's no ands, ifs, or what's about it. You have to come in there with the goods every Friday. And, I doubt anybody ever worked 9 to 5 at Ripley's, no matter what their job was. It's a full-time gig.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, I believe that.
And like you say, people were spending 40, 50 years and enjoying Well, I don't think you enjoy every moment of it, Edward, but probably.
God. No, definitely not every moment.
Not every moment, but quite a few of them.
I just mean, that late night television was always a source for Ripley people. I mean, somebody had to stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning and watch Johnny Carson every night. I mean, it never was anywhere near a 9 to 5. I probably worked a 70-hour week every year of my life.
And that's why you have so many incredible memories at this time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Edward, we've still got some more things we'd like to run by you, all things Ripley. So if we could get you to return for a third episode, then we could start off with your telling us about the portrait of Mona Lisa that was made from toast.
Well, again, I'm always willing and happy to talk about Edward. It's my favorite subject. Ripley isn't too far behind it, but Mona Lisa from toast. Well, yeah.
All right.
You want me to?
All right, we're going to save that one. And so, Edward, we're going to talk about all things Edward once again, right, Gary?
Absolutely. We're so excited. This has been a lot of fun.
Ooh, you're not kidding.
All right, well, hold on, folks. We still got more to come, but until next time.
Oh, unfortunately, we got another episode coming up, Gary. I'm Richard.
And I'm Gary, and this is a continuing incredible story.
I hope they didn't burn that toast.
That's how they make it.